In Washington state, 2 people die agonizing deaths. Both are victims of poison-laced Excedrin capsules. The news causes public panic and costs manufacturers tens of millions of dollars. In Virginia, a cardiac care unit experiences an epidemic of unexpected deaths. Is this bad care or bad luck? Or is it something more sinister? And a man tries to murder his wife in an insurance fraud.
Your emergency?
I've got a medical emergency. My wife is going into some kind of convulsion. And her mouth is foaming.
Poisoners are among the most elusive killers. Today, forensic detectives are employing an arsenal of techniques to uncover and convict them. Who is winning the war?
And how's Miss Thomas doing?
No, she's doing great.
Good. Can we take her chart? I'm moving down and check on her.
It is 9 o'clock on a Saturday night when Dr. Joseph Whittle makes his final rounds. Whittle is co-director of the Coronary Care Unit at General Hospital in Petersburg, Virginia.
I'm Miss Thomas. I'm Dr. Whittle.
He has been on duty since noon. It is time to go home. Among his patients is Josephine Thomas, a 73-year-old retired teacher. She was admitted with heart problems several hours earlier and now is resting comfortably. At around 11 p.m., Whittle orders an IV.
Miss Thomas? Miss Thomas?
The duty nurse signals a code blue, a patient emergency, and calls in Dr. Whittle. Josephine Thomas is in crisis. It takes Whittle just 15 minutes to return.
Everyone clear? Shocking?
Too late. Josephine Thomas cannot be revived. The death troubles the staff. An epidemic of unexpected deaths has struck the cardiac care unit in the past few weeks. 2 nurses suspect that Josephine Thomas may not have died of natural causes. Their suspicions deepen an hour and a half later, when a package of lidocaine is found to be missing.
Okay, lidocaine 2 gram.
No.
You don't find any 2 gram?
We didn't use a 2 gram.
Right. Well, we should have 1 2 gram lidocaine in.
I don't have one.
Lidocaine is a drug given to stabilize heartbeat. In large concentrations, it can be fatal. Whenever a death seems unusual or suspicious, medical and law enforcement personnel are required to contact the medical examiner's office.
Hi, Dr. Fierro. How are you?
Hello, Jim. How
Dr. Marcella Fierro is chief medical examiner for the state of Virginia. In her first year as an assistant medical examiner, she worked on the Petersburg case.
The problem arose when it became apparent that there was, one, an increased number of deaths in the unit as compared to previous months, and secondly, that a significant number of them were occurring in the presence of or were being discovered by Leroy Hargrave.
Evening, ladies.
Leroy Hargrave was a 21-year-old nurse's aide, whose reputation around the hospital was decidedly mixed. It was Hargrave who had called the alert on Josephine Thomas. Several other deaths had also occurred during Hargrave's shifts. Was this coincidence, or was something else going on? No one had seen Hargrave do anything wrong. It would take all the resources of forensic science to establish what had happened. Throughout the United States, an autopsy is performed whenever the cause of death is unknown. This unknown male was found dead on a Michigan street.
All right, go ahead and check the status of the hair, looking for any injuries on the head.
How did the individual die? Was it natural death, an accident, a homicide, or suicide? Sometimes the answer is undetermined.
Did you make it to a hospital?
No, not this guy. He was found dead in an older part of town. I'm wondering about lead poisoning. You think we ought to get a heavy metal screen on him?
I think it'd be a good idea.
Why don't we get some head hair too,
right,
since arsenic can accumulate in the hair. If we do find arsenic on the general heavy metal screen, then we can fractionate the hair. Since hair grows about 1 centimeter a month, see if there's any chronicity to the poisoning.
Pathologists gather a variety of samples, including muscle tissue, brain, kidney, urine, and blood.
About 30 cc's will be enough, Paul. All right, let's get a piece of kidney too, Paul.
All right.
Each sample may tell a story about the victim's life and death. Poisoning is a rare occurrence, according to James Valentour, head of the toxicology laboratory for the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Poisoning is not automatically suspected. It depends on the circumstances or lack of other evidence following the investigation. If an autopsy is conducted on a young person in otherwise apparent good health and no cause of death is found, then the suspicion of drug involvement or drug contribution to that death increases, and we proportionally increase our analyses until we rule out all the possibilities that we can.
Today, poison specialists, called toxicologists, employ a bewildering array of sophisticated technologies. Antibodies, protein substances the body produces to combat foreign matter, are used to detect toxins. To test for cocaine and its metabolic products, for example, blood is mixed with antibodies specific to certain parts of the cocaine molecule. A fluorescent label is added to the mixture. If cocaine is present, the pattern of fluorescence changes. To identify poison compounds, they must be broken down into smaller parts called ions. Dr. Valentour and his colleagues use the most powerful techniques available, which include the gas chromatograph and mass spectrometer, which are often used in combination. Chemicals are added to a sample to separate any organic drugs present from the blood matrix. The isolated portion is vaporized and passed along a hydrogen-filled tube. Molecules of different size migrate through the tube at different rates. As molecules emerge from the tube, their concentration is measured. Next, the mass spectrometer shatters the molecule into ions, its chemical building blocks. A complex molecule may generate hundreds of ion fragments. The pattern of ions produced is unique to a particular molecule. To identify the unknown substance, its ion signature is compared to those of tens of thousands of chemicals in the computer's database. In time, techniques like these would reveal not one, but 6 poisonings at Petersburg General Hospital.
Logic Poison Center, can I help you?
The world is filled with deadly chemicals. An average home harbors dozens of dangerous substances, such as chlorine bleach, drain opener, and aspirin, each capable of causing death. The Blodgett Regional Poison Center in Grand Rapids, Michigan, receives thousands of anxious phone calls each year. Many concern overdoses, accidental or intentional. Many more involve children who have eaten some bright berry or sampled the household bleach. And a few involve deliberate attempts to kill. John Trestrail directs the center and is an authority on poisons and poisoners.
Well, poisoning homicides differ from normal homicides in that there usually are no witnesses. There are no visible signs of trauma. You see no bullet holes, no stab wounds, no bruises. Usually it's very covert, very secret. The evidence is usually lacking. There's no cartridge cases or anything. Often it's missed, and this crime scene is cleaned up.
Trestrail's office reveals a lifetime of fascination with things poisonous.
Take, for example, spiders. We know that this small spider compared to one big spider here, you say, well, which one's more poisonous? Well, most little kids will say, obviously the big one. Well, the tarantula is no more worse than being stung by a bee, but the black widow is capable of killing. So size is not always associated with degree of deadliness.
In Trestrail's view, mankind's knowledge of poisons is extremely ancient. In all likelihood, it goes back to making the connection between eating something and getting sick.
Okay, here we have an example of what primitive man might have first associated cause and effect relationships with. Here is a mushroom called the fly agaric, common name, Amanita muscaria. And it contains chemicals that produce hallucinations and a lot of other bad garbage that go with it. But I'm sure at one time in prehistory, man looked at someone eating this and said, what he did when he ate this was it caused these symptoms. And from that they said, this mushroom contains these poisons. I have this knowledge. This knowledge led to mystery and the shadowy figures of the shamans and witch doctors and everything. So the whole history of toxicology began a couple of 100,000 years ago. It was probably the third weapon developed after the stick and the stone, the poison.
The essence of poisoning is stealth. To shoot or strangle a person, the murderer must be present. Poison offers the opportunity of long-distance homicide. There is also the chance that homicide won't be recorded at all, that the death will be deemed due to natural causes. This is what had occurred at Petersburg General Hospital, until Josephine Thomas's death began to arouse suspicions.
The first lady came in and was autopsied and was found to have serious heart disease, but she also had lethal concentrations of lidocaine in her blood and in her tissues, which she should not have had because she had no order for it in her chart, nor had she been given lidocaine during her code.
Concerned about the rising death rate, the hospital reviewed all the fatalities since Leroy Hargrave had been assigned to the unit.
And they identified 10 persons that they thought might be at risk for lidocaine poisoning.
James Dalton, now a judge, was assistant Commonwealth's attorney in Petersburg when the deaths took place.
I received a call from an attorney. He said, we've got something I hope doesn't exist, but I'm afraid that there's a possibility that there have been a number of people actually killed at the hospital.
Dalton also learned the name of the chief suspect, Leroy Hargrave.
They were on his shift, and his shift may have varied, but he moved around, so whenever he was on a shift. But it was a night shift normally that these occurred, and I guess it was not too suspicious initially because I think there is some history of people dying at night more frequently.
So far, the evidence was circumstantial. Hargrave happened to be around when the deaths took place. To convince Dalton, and ultimately a jury, that they were premeditated murders, the medical examiner had to show that the patients had been given lidocaine in unusual amounts. The task was made more difficult because several of the victims had been dead for several months.
It was a toxicological masterpiece as far as detective work because in one case they're working with fresh tissue. In other instances, they had to recover the poison from bodies which had been embalmed and buried. And in the third instance, they had to try and establish sufficient tissue levels in the biopsy samples from the previous autopsies. When it was all over, of those 10 deaths that were suspicious, 6 were established as due to acute lidocaine poisoning.
Prosecutors pieced together a likely scenario leading to Josephine Thomas's death. It begins with Hargrave stealing some lidocaine. Once the cardiac care unit has settled for the night, he slips into Thomas's room unobserved. After loading a hypodermic with a massive dose of lidocaine, he temporarily disables Thomas's cardiac monitor alarm. Within seconds of administering the drug, it will disrupt the rhythm of Thomas's heart, causing a fatal seizure. Then, Hargrave raises the alarm to divert suspicion from himself.
We need some help in here!
Leroy Hargrave was convicted of poisoning Josephine Thomas and sentenced to life imprisonment. He never confessed, and his motive for killing Thomas and the other patients was never established. Dr. Fierro talks about one theory.
The code, the actual code procedure, the cardiac arrest procedure with the response by a resuscitation team is a very dramatic event. It's very intense, it's very rapid. There are orders, there's no pleases, there's no thank yous, there's just instructions. And this is quite exciting to persons who are on the outside, you know, if you're not related to the person who's being coded. So it was thought that he really got into the code.
Without the initial suspicions of the nurses, without the technology to precisely identify lidocaine weeks or months after death, Leroy Hargrave might have gone free. John Trestrail.
How many bodies do you dig up to find a bullet hole? None. They catch that before they're buried. How many bodies do you dig up to find a poison? Most of them. We're missing them at the point of death, and we're burying the evidence. That's difficult to overcome, but that's what we're going to do.
Among the most difficult poisonings to detect are those involving product tampering. In 1982, 7 people in Chicago died from poison-laced Tylenol. A rash of copycat crimes followed, each with its own bizarre twist. June 11, 1986, the town of Auburn, Washington.
Hey, Mom?
15-year-old Haley Snow finds her mother collapsed in the bathroom. Susan Snow is unconscious. Her pulse is weak. Her breaths come in long, irregular gasps. Haley dials 911. Within 4 hours, this apparently healthy 40-year-old mother of 2 will be declared dead. When paramedics arrive at Seattle's Harborview Medical Center, Susan Snow is comatose. Harborview is the best trauma center in the Northwest, but Snow is fading fast. Snow's condition puzzles the emergency team. Her brain appears swollen, inflamed. She is struggling for breath, and her vital signs are failing. She never recovers consciousness. An hour after admission, she is declared brain dead. What appeared at first as a random death soon will be revealed as murder. It will cost a pharmaceutical company tens of millions of dollars, incite public panic, and set off one of the largest law enforcement operations ever mounted in Washington state. Special Agents Jack Cusack and Mike Byrne were part of the FBI investigation team.
The first victim in this case was Sue Snow. She was a 40-year-old bank teller that lived in Auburn, Washington. And in her daily routine, she always ingested Excedrin.
The cause of Susan Snow's death emerged almost by chance. At her autopsy, the assistant medical examiner noticed the smell of bitter almonds, a telltale sign of cyanide poisoning. Many people cannot detect the odor. By a quirk of genetics, the assistant medical examiner could. Dying by cyanide isn't pleasant. Inside each cell, cyanide displaces oxygen in the energy transport mechanism. Deprived of oxygen, cells collapse. The body dies, slowly asphyxiating, bit by bit. By June 16th, the cyanide source had been identified, the bottle of extra-strength Excedrin capsules in Susan Snow's kitchen. 750,000 bottles of Excedrin were immediately recalled or withdrawn. The news made headlines all over America. Fresh in everyone's minds were the Tylenol poisonings in Chicago. How many would die this time? To catch a poisoner, it helps to get inside his or her head. John Trestrail explains how poisoners target their victims.
One is type S, S meaning specific victim. That victim has a name. They know exactly who it's going to be, whether it's their spouse or whether it's a political figure or somebody. They're going out after an individual with a name. The other type is type R, random victim. In other words, they know they're going to get somebody, they have no idea who it's going to be. And this is where you find your tamperers who are at work, either for ego or for industrial blackmail. And sometimes you can actually find individuals cloaked and camouflaged as random poisoners that are specific. So this gets to be a real mind game, the investigation of this kind of an offender.
Susan Snow's death, it would turn out, was a random killing. She was poisoned in a cold-blooded attempt to draw attention away from the real target. On June 5th, 6 days before Susan Snow died, Bruce Nickell had suddenly collapsed at his mobile home in Kent, Washington. When paramedics arrived, they found the 52-year-old Nickell on his back, gasping for breath. His face was cherry red, his body deathly pale. The paramedics had never seen such symptoms before. Nickell's wife, Stella, told them he had been complaining of headaches. Shortly before collapsing, he had taken 2 extra-strength Excedrin capsules. Stella emphasized Excedrin over and over, the paramedics would remember later. She even retrieved the bottle from her kitchen. Evacuated to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, Nickell died a few hours later. The autopsy recorded death from natural causes. Nickell had died from emphysema.
Strangely enough, Stella Nickell was also making a few additional calls on her own. She called her doctor, "Are you sure this is what he died of?" She called the paramedics. It could have been anything else. Are you sure that he died of natural causes? She wasn't quite that obvious, but she did make these telephone calls.
Stella called again after news of Susan Snow's poisoning appeared. The lot number of Snow's Excedrin matched the capsules Bruce had taken. Tests quickly proved that Nickell's capsules were laced with cyanide. Nickell's body had been buried, but a vial of his blood remained. It too was tested. Again, cyanide. Across the state, shelves were cleared of Excedrin. But of the thousands of bottles screened, only 5 were found to contain cyanide.
A little quirky thing about that was Stella had 2 of the bottles. And even more strange than that was, she said, "Hey, I bought one of the bottles about a month before Bruce died. And I bought the second bottle a little more than a week before he died." The odds of that are unbelievable.
Stella's deadly plan began to unfold. First, she poisoned Bruce with cyanide-laced capsules. Then, to make his death appear a random killing, she placed more contaminated capsules on drugstore shelves. Investigators began searching for a motive. They soon found one: insurance fraud.
When Bruce Nickell died, and he was found to have died of natural causes, Stella stood to gain approximately $31,000. If he died accidental death, then this jumped up to about $178,000, and in addition to that, she had a couple $20,000 policies.
To insurance companies, dying by poison counts as accidental death. But had Bruce taken out the policies? Handwriting experts scrutinized his signatures, comparing them to Stella's. The height and width of a letter, its shape and slope, all contain telltale clues. So does the fluidity, the flow and rhythm of the writing, which is very hard to fake. Bruce had not signed the documents. Stella had. Could the investigators now tie Stella to the cyanide? When the capsules were shipped to the FBI's toxicology laboratory in Washington, D.C., an unexpected clue appeared. The white powder was contaminated with tiny green specks. The specks were 99% sodium chloride, ordinary table salt. Bulking out products with salt is a common manufacturing practice. But what of the remaining 1%? Laboratory analysis revealed 4 separate chemicals. 2 were used almost exclusively in preparations called algicides. One commercial product contained all 4 of the chemicals. It came in the form of tablets, which were bright green.
The laboratory called us back and said, "We have positively identified those green crystals as a product known as algae destroyer. It's an algicide used in fish tanks by fish fanciers." And that really rang a bell for us because from the first time any of our agents went in Stella's residence, it was obvious she was a fish fancier. She had fish aquariums all around the front room.
The cyanide had led to algae destroyer. Would algae destroyer now lead to Stella? Agents combed pet stores all over Seattle. Someone might remember Stella and the kind of algicide she preferred. The search ended at a store not far from where Stella lived. It stocked algae destroyer, and the manager recognized a photograph of the woman who frequently bought it there. It was Stella Nickell. For months after Bruce Nickell's murder, Stella avoided taking a polygraph test. Her health would not permit it, she explained. In November 1986, she finally agreed to cooperate. The test is designed to pick up tiny physiological changes. Blood pressure and pulse rate are carefully monitored. Each may change when an individual lies. Forensic detectives use the polygraph to eliminate innocent individuals from their suspect list. That was not to be Stella's fate.
I remember the comment she made when we were walking back to the examination room. And she kind of turned around and said, "I feel as though I'm walking into a lion's den." I didn't understand the significance of that comment, but I thought, a little unusual. Stella took the examination. I formulated the questions. They were clear-cut. Did you cause your husband's death? Did you put potassium cyanide in those extra-strength Excedrin capsules? Stella clearly showed deception on the test. When we informed her of that in a straightforward fashion, she asked for her attorney, who was in the waiting room, and basically, everybody knows how the Miranda rights go. That pretty much terminated that interview that day.
More trouble was in store for Stella. This time it came from an unexpected source, her daughter, Cindy. When she heard Stella had failed the polygraph, she contacted Jack Cusack.
You know, there's no doubt about it. We had a lot of good breaks come our way in this case. And one that paid off initially was the fact that Stella's daughter, Cindy, decided to share with us some of the conversations that she had with her mother out at the airport.
In 1985, after years of feuding, Stella and Cindy briefly reconciled. They even got jobs together as security guards at Seattle's SeaTac Airport. It was there, in the pauses between flights, that Cindy heard hints of Stella's plan. First, Stella asked her daughter where she might buy heroin. What was a lethal dose? How much cocaine? Then she talked about hiring a hitman to shoot Bruce while she was out of town, or, less plausibly, to kill him in an automobile crash. Finally, she talked about poisoning Bruce.
You know, Cindy told us that, my mother spent a lot of time doing research at the library. She said, my mother would go to the libraries within the Seattle area, within King County, and research various plants.
At first, Stella hoped to identify poisonous plants on her property, which she could surreptitiously feed to Bruce. To check out Cindy's story, the FBI sent teams of agents to every library in South Kent County. It was a monumental task. They were searching for a book, any book, that would tie Stella to poison. Boxes of books were sent back to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. There, a team of examiners scrutinized them for Stella's fingerprints.
We're kind of part of the human behavior aspect of the case, and that's, in a lot of ways, that's pretty interesting. You're in on the interviews, you're kind of putting the pieces of the puzzle together. A lot of the unsung heroes in this is the poor guy back in the FBI laboratory that gets a half a truckload of books and a set of fingerprints and said, find him in there, and he spends months and months, and all of a sudden calls us up one day and says, hey, in this one book of the multitude of books you sent me, I found 104 of Stella's fingertips in there, and I found 3 palm prints. And you can imagine when we're on the receiving end of a telephone call like that.
The circle was closing on Stella. Special Agent Mike Byrne.
So now we have library books that we went out, came up with her latent prints on library books where she actually researched cyanide. We had the insurance where she forged Bruce's signature, and now we had the algae destroy product that she actually purchased.
On May 9th, 1988, Stella Nickell was found guilty of murdering Bruce Nickell and Susan Snow. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole.
She never buckled. When Jack had a chance to interview her, said you failed the polygraph examination, it was just a stone face. And she never buckled. Even to this day, she's never said anything.
No one saw Stella poison Bruce. She never even met Susan Snow. Still, she refuses to face her guilt. Denial may be a characteristic of poisoners. According to John Trestrail, imagination is another.
We also find that poisoners are very intelligent, certainly more so than the typical brute-like clubbing of an individual as a sophistication of the weapon's delivery. We find they're very artistic. By artistic, I don't mean they paint pretty pictures, but I mean that they can design almost something like a play.
Investigators believe Joe Mealing adopted Stella Nickell's scenario when he read about her story in Reader's Digest. The case begins on February 2nd, 1991, in Tumwater, Washington, 50 miles southwest of Stella Nickell's home. One evening, as the Mealings are preparing for bed, Joe reminds his wife Jennifer to take a Sudafed. Jennifer's snoring disturbs him, he claims. She must be congested. Jennifer does not feel congested, but under Joe's continued pressure, she agrees. A week earlier, Joe had purchased some Sudafed capsules. But why Sudafed, which they have never used? And why capsules? After Stella Nickell, Jennifer is wary of using them. Moments later, Jennifer collapses and rapidly becomes unconscious. Special Agent Tom Turgeson was involved with the FBI investigation.
What happens when someone is poisoned by sodium cyanide, was perhaps best described by Joe Mealing himself when he called the 911 operator and described to the operator what was happening to his wife.
My wife is going to some kind of convulsion.
Second Avenue South.
Yes, 1111, 2nd Avenue South, number 2.
Has she ever had a
No,
seizure
she's
before?
never had a problem before. No.
How old is she?
She's 29, 28. She called me from the other room, and her mouth is foaming.
Take a deep breath. You need to be calm for your wife, okay?
Yes, I'm calm.
Okay. Does she use drugs or on any medication of any kind?
She just took a Sudafed.
It was fast, it was swift, and she was in agony.
Rushed to the emergency room, Jennifer is in a coma. The staff struggles to save her life, treating Jennifer for diabetic ketoacidosis, elevated acid and blood sugar levels. In the midst of it all, Joe Mealing makes a curious suggestion to the physician in charge. Have you considered poison, cyanide in particular? Miraculously, Jennifer recovers. She tells the emergency room doctor that she had taken Sudafed at her husband's insistence. The doctor alerts the police and orders a cyanide test. Next day, his suspicions are confirmed. There is cyanide in Jennifer's blood. Without Joe Mealing's comments about cyanide, Jennifer Mealing's poisoning might have been overlooked, just as Bruce Nickell's poisoning initially was missed. But why don't toxicology laboratories routinely screen for cyanide? Washington State toxicologist Dr. Barry Logan.
It's relatively uncommon to uncover an unsuspected poisoning. Usually if an investigation has been done properly by the investigator's office, by the coroner's office, we have information up front about what the circumstances are surrounding the death, so we know whether it's likely to be a poisoning or not.
Dozens of compounds show up on routine drug screening tests. Cyanide does not. And there is a further complication.
Prior tests for cyanide have taken a long time to do, and it's been difficult to generate the results in a way in which the information can be used effectively by the investigators.
Before 1991, detecting cyanide involved a multi-step test which took at least a day to complete. Every sample of tissue or blood had to be tested separately. Dr. Logan has devised a simpler procedure, a litmus test. Chemicals are added to a sample generating hydrogen cyanide gas, if cyanide is present. At the same time, the litmus strip, paper impregnated with a complex of chemicals, is added to the tube. If hydrogen cyanide has been produced, the strip turns purple. The degree of coloration is a rough guide to how much cyanide the sample contains.
The test that we currently use in this lab to screen for the presence of cyanide is very easy to do. We can do a large number of screens in a short period of time, which is a big advantage.
Within days of Jennifer Mealing's near poisoning, Dr. Logan had the opportunity to try out his new tests. On February 11th and February 18th, there were two mysterious deaths. Both fell within Logan's jurisdiction.
We conducted our full drug screen on the sample and found the presence of therapeutic levels of a compound called pseudoephedrine, which is the major component of Sudafed. That in itself wasn't particularly remarkable, but at the pathologist's request, we also did a test for cyanide. The cyanide test came back strongly positive, a level that indicated almost certainly the cause of death as being cyanide poisoning.
On March 1st, a pattern finally emerged. 3 cyanide poisonings, 2 deaths. All 3 victims had taken Sudafed. Next day, Sudafed was withdrawn, and the FBI was called in.
Before we've actually focused on Joe, because that's one of the things we look at are the victim families. But Joe made several comments that he is the primary suspect and that he's too smart to ever be caught, and he certainly wouldn't be caught by the FBI.
But Joe Mealing underestimated the agent's tenacity. and the FBI's resources. FBI agents carefully examined the backing of the Sudafed packages in the hopes of finding some evidence of tampering. They found that on untampered packages, the foil breaks when the pill is pushed through the back, leaving a jagged edge. But on the tampered packages, the break in the foil was smooth. Mealing had removed the capsules with a razor, carefully slicing them from the package so he could replace them later.
Throughout the investigation, we tried to learn about nearly every aspect of Joe Mealing's life. We tried to reconstruct everything that he did for a fairly extensive time period, geographically place him into the areas of the crime scenes, to find out what's making him tick, try to find the motive, how does he operate. We want to know everything about Joe Mealing.
Joe and Jennifer married in 1986. From the beginning, they had quarreled, mostly about money. Jennifer took multiple jobs to make ends meet. Joe indulged his hobbies: photography, computer, and theatrical makeup. But in the days before her poisoning, Jennifer later admitted, Joe's normal behavior had changed. 5 days before her collapse, Joe bought the Sudafed capsules, which neither of them had used before. When Jennifer returned home, she found Joe polishing his gram scale. Why now? He had not used it in 18 months. Stranger still, Joe was wearing latex gloves. He never cleaned the kitchen. It wasn't his job. Finally, there was the matter of the insurance policy. Joe caught Jennifer on the way to work one day and asked her to sign what she thought was a small life insurance policy for only $30,000.
He knew exactly what he was doing. He asked her to sign it. When she was in a hurry, on the way out the door, she signs, and now he has a total of $700,000 on her life.
Catching poisoners is rarely quick or easy. Despite the forensic detective's arsenal of sophisticated scientific techniques, often the most important element of a successful investigation is sheer doggedness. The FBI evidence response team begins by meticulously examining a crime scene. Agents don special clothing, not to protect themselves, but to safeguard the evidence. With today's ultra-sensitive techniques, a single drop of blood or saliva, a strand of hair or scraping of skin may seal the conviction of a criminal. Careful record keeping is vital. Where each item was found, when and by whom must be documented if the evidence is to stand up in court. FBI headquarters in Washington receives so many items of evidence for testing each day, it has been given its own zip code. Fingerprints still remain among the most important clues. The FBI has more than 200 million on file. There are dozens of ways to develop otherwise invisible prints, latent prints. One of the most effective is with the vapor of superglue, which adheres to the print and raises it to the surface. In the Sudafed poisoning case, Agent Turgeson and his colleagues fingerprinted every piece of evidence that might implicate Joe Mealing. 6 contaminated bottles were eventually retrieved, but Joe's fingerprints could not be found. Dozens of library books were examined, again without success. Perhaps Joe remembered that fingerprints helped catch Stella Nickell, and so he wore rubber gloves. FBI agents mapped the locations where the tampered packs were found. Joe told the FBI he bought Sudafed from a store near his house. Other tampered packages turned up in a store in the Lacey area near Joe's work. But 4 stores in Tacoma also had tampered product. Special Agent Tom Turgeson.
The red dots indicate places where we could place Joe Mealing through physical evidence, through receipts, through witnesses, and other methods. Place him in one store, for instance, and in other areas around the time frame of the tamperings and in the immediate surroundings of those stores.
Joe's link to the 2 stores near his home and work were evident enough. But what of the 4 stores in Tacoma?
We found out that Joe would frequent the stripper bars and talk to the strippers and seemingly just relate his problems to them. We found several of the dancers from topless dance clubs who recognized Joe Mealing, who testified against him at the trial, who placed him up here at certain dates and times. Some of them said he was a regular frequenter of the establishments, and they easily recognized him.
The investigators had tied Joe to the tampered Sudafed packages. Could they now tie him to the cyanide? As the major suspect, the FBI tapped Joe's telephone early on in the investigation. One day, they heard him describe in vivid detail a building he had once visited. From the description, FBI agents identified it as the Emerald City Chemical Company in Kent, Washington. Among other things, Emerald City Chemicals sells cyanide. When investigators examined the poison register for the day Joe had visited the area, they could not find his signature. A Richard P. Johnson had bought cyanide that day. It was all the FBI required. As in the Stella Nickell case, handwriting analysis proved decisive. Despite Joe Mealing's attempt to disguise his handwriting, there are clear similarities between Richard P. Johnson's signature and Joe's own. Consider the formation of the J, for example, the shape of the O, and the way the letters sit upon the line. The person who signed the poison register was Joe.
It was determined that Joe Mealing purchased 1 pound of sodium cyanide on January 11. A pound similar to this container, which is a representative container of sodium cyanide in the amount of 1 pound. That's a lot of poison, considering a pill the size of a Sudafed capsule killed 2 people and injured 1 other.
One last point puzzled the investigators. When the clerk at the chemical store was shown a photograph of Joe Mealing, he failed to recognize him.
In the residence of Joe Mealing, we found this array of theatrical makeup equipment. Experts in theatrical makeup testified at his trial and determined on the witness stand that there is the equipment here available to make someone up to be unrecognizable as to their true identity. We found a photograph of a person who looks elderly, graying hair, wrinkled face, and it's a friend of Joe Mealing in his late 20s, early 30s.
It had taken 18 months of exhaustive investigation, but by August 1992, the FBI case against Joe Mealing was complete. Shortly before Jennifer's poisoning, he prepared 6 packages of Sudafed. In each, he replaced the Sudafed with capsules filled with lethal doses of cyanide. 5 packets he returned to drugstore shelves. 1 remained at home, to kill Jennifer. Joe Mealing was indicted on 2 counts of murder and the attempted murder of Jennifer Mealing. He is now serving life imprisonment. Among evidence discovered at Joe's home, agents found one last item of note, an outline for a screenplay about the poisoning of Jennifer. The protagonist, James Martin, is described as devoted, honest, reliable, sincere, truthful.
Joe Mealing was greedy. He was very selfish. I don't think he was concerned about the health and welfare of his wife, Jennifer. He's concerned about Joe.
Just as Stella Nickell learned from the Tylenol poisonings and Joe Mealing learned from Stella Nickell's mistakes, so too investigators learn to prevent and detect such murders. Dr. Barry Logan.
There's no way to to prevent a product from being tampered with. What we can do is package it in such a way that if anything is done to interfere with the material, that it's evident to the person when they buy it from the supermarket or before they use the product.
What's important for the conviction of a poisoner are 4 things I call the conviction pyramid. Number 1, we have to have the victim. Then number 2, we have to have the poisoner. And then we have to have the poison and the intent. And all these things have to be linked together. Poison to victim, poison to offender, offender to victim, and then finally the intent. Was the intent really to kill that victim? Once you get those 4 things locked on, then you have the potential for a conviction.
Each year, forensic science provides investigators with powerful new tools. How many poisoners still elude detection? We don't know. Perhaps more than we would like to admit. Who is winning the battle? In the end, no one. The fight goes on.